The Black Hebrews insist that the Bible contains the true words of God and that we African Americans are the people found in Deuteronomy chapter 28. However, that scripture says that those people will be delivered from bondage once reaching 400 years. We African Americans have now been in the U.S. for more than 400 years. If the scripture is true, and if we are those people, we should have exited the U.S. in 2019. The 400-year anniversary since the first enslaved Africans were brought in chains to the U.S. This profound contradiction exists because a Bible that strongly condones slavery, written by ungodly Romans that routinely engaged in massive orgies and death sports, does not contain the true words of God. The Black Hebrews insist that it does contain the true words of God because their minds are lost within the wilderness of ignorance. A speaker of truth has no friends, African proverb. Usually people have the right to believe whatever they choose to believe. But that's a luxury that the oppressed does not have. The oppressed must function based upon what's actually true in order to liberate ourselves. Because if our beliefs are flawed, then all of our liberating remedies, strategies, and solutions that stem from those flawed beliefs will also be flawed. Therefore, I will not be silent to appease Black ignorance, given that it's Black ignorance that prevents our liberation. Those who know the truth must teach, African proverb. Let's discuss the truth about the Black Hebrews. During the presidency of Jimmy Carter, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a national security advisor and political scientist, wrote a paper that was sent to all State Department government agencies telling them that they had to do everything within their powers to prevent African Americans from uniting with Native Africans politically, culturally, and economically. When Africans are divided globally, we lose our numerical advantage and we're stripped of all hopes of ever defeating global white supremacy. The white society's exploitation of Africans has provided it with an era of which it has flourished most throughout history. To allow this era to become threatened by the global unification of Africans would be directly against the interests of the white society, especially given that the white society's dependence on Africa's natural resources is never ending. Therefore, to prevent the global unification of Africans, white propagandists started creating and deploying propaganda and false ideologies designed to breed division between African Americans and Native Africans. The recent ideology that we African Americans are not Africans is just one of them. It's the latest one. They also divide us from Africa by negatively distorting the image of Africa. They've literally turned Africa into a source of shame and humiliation for millions of African Americans because it's easier to separate people from something they've been made to be ashamed of. White media propagandists have so denigrated the image of Africa that many African Americans will now accept any frivolous premise that allows them to claim themselves as being anything other than an African. It should come as no surprise that some African Americans would want to disassociate themselves from Africa, given how negatively distorted the white media depicts Africa. It's in fact should be well expected. The Black Hebrew Israelite ideology is also a false ideology that has divided millions of African Americans from Native Africans by teaching its followers that they're not Africans, although millions of DNA analysis have scientifically confirmed that we are in fact Africans. They base this division upon the story of Noah's sons, Ham and Shem. They claim that Africans are of Ham and that African Americans are of Shem. However, Shem and Ham never actually existed. The Noah's Ark story never happened. It's not even a Hebrew mythology. It is a totally unadulterated falsehood. The men who wrote the Bible plagiarized it from a Mesopotamian story called the Gilgamesh epic. The Gilgamesh epic. That Mesopotamian story even includes the mythology that the first rainbow came after God flooded the world. We also know that the biblical flood never occurred because there have existed great civilization thriving during that time. They kept good records and never mentioned of a great flood that wiped them from the face of the earth. These civilizations included the Egyptian dynasties 4, 5, and 6, the Chinese dynasty, the Mesopotamian dynasty, the Sumerian dynasty, and the Peruvian dynasty, and more. In reality, there was never a flood that covered the entire planet and destroyed the entire world. It's a fairy tale. Furthermore, no Jews built the pyramids because Jews didn't exist at the period when the pyramids were built. It wasn't until over 600 years after the last of the large pyramids had been built that Israel came into existence, and over 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid had been completed. No Jews built the ancient kingdom of Africa's ancient Egypt because it is thousands of years older than the biblical timeline of when Shem, the supposed father of the Jews, had lived. According to biblical scholars, Shem survived the flood 4,300 years ago. However, according to several experts, the Great Pyramid of Giza is around 12,000 years old. 12,000 years old. The leading expert says that the Great Sphinx is even much older. Since they're both many thousand years older than the time Shem was in existence, it's impossible that any Jews were involved in building the Great Sphinx or the pyramid. Furthermore, the city of Egypt is even older than the timeline of when Adam and Eve were supposedly created. According to biblical experts that use detailed family trees in the Bible to make their calculation, Adam and Eve lived around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. The story that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt and built the ancient kingdom is an absolute lie. The false white collar Jews created the story and inserted themselves into the great history of Africa's ancient Egypt. The Bible is not a history book. It's a work of fiction. There is no evidence of the existence of Hebrews in Egypt. According to Exodus 12:40, the Israelites lived in Egypt for 430 years. The Bible mentions Egypt about 700 times, yet there's no mentions of the Israelites in any of the Egyptian history, nor is any archaeological evidence outside of what the Bible writes. Nothing outside of the scriptures. There's no evidence of a leader named Moses. There's no synagogue. There is no mention of Jews or any of the 10 plagues in the entire history of Egypt. We have no clue, not even a single word about the early Israelites in Egypt. Neither on the monumental inscriptions on the walls of the temple, nor anywhere. Israel is absent as a possible foe of Egypt, as a friend of Egypt, or as an enslaved nation. If the story that the Israelites in Egypt was true, there would have been some evidence of it. There is none. Those who say it's true are lying. There is no evidence. There is none. Although the walls of the pyramids were left with thousands of writings upon them documenting the long history of ancient Egypt, the enslavement of a Jewish people is not written even once, nor was the name of Moses ever written, nor was the story about the Red Sea parting and rejoining. Certainly if the Red Sea had actually parted to allow the Jews to walk through it and then rejoined itself to drown a Pharaoh and his army, such an event would have been documented upon the walls of Egypt. It's not. It's not documented because the story is totally fabricated. The builders were not even slaves. Egyptians had paid laborers who built the pyramids. It is now estimated that about 10,000 to 30,000, rather than 100,000, as I said, were paid workers. They were responsible for building the pyramids in ancient times. Local Egyptians from poor families worked on the tombs out of loyalty to the pharaohs, said Dieter Winberg, a former director of the Berlin Egyptian Museum. They were respected and earned the right to be buried near their pharaohs. In the 1990s, graves of the laborers were found by a tourist who came across what appeared to have been a wall, was actually a tomb. Egypt archaeology, Sahi Hawass, concluded no way would they have been buried so honorably if they were slaves. They said workers built up the tombs. There's evidence that they were not slaves. The entire story we was taught is a lie. Their bodies were even perfectly preserved. The treatment of them showed that they weren't slaves. The treatment of the pyramid workers were well fed, laborers, and they worked, and they did tests on their bodies and everything. And the evidence that they were well taken care of. There's even evidence that one had surgery on his skull, and he lived 2 years past the surgery. They say had they been slaves, they wouldn't have performed the surgery on him. They would have let him die. They were not slaves. The most undeniable evidence that the Egypt pyramids were built by paid workers and not slaves is the pyramids themselves. Due to the shrinking budget, pyramids gradually got smaller over time. In other words, money paid to the pyramid laborers to construct the tombs became lesser as the economy shrunk. We also know that the Bible is untrue because according to it, the first man and woman was Adam and Eve. That accordingly they said lived between 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. The problem with that calculation is that science has confirmed time and time again that Africans are much older than that date. In South Africa, scientists unearthed ancient bones belonging to at least 15 individuals. These bodies are estimated to be between 20,000 to 1,000,000 years old. There was also the remains called Lucy found in Ethiopia, estimated to be 3 million years old. These findings of African bodies that are much older than the fictional biblical story of Adam and Eve prove that the story is untrue, that they were the first people on earth. Everything we've been taught by the white society are lies. When Black Hebrews divide their millions of followers from Native Africans based upon a work of fiction, we're making damn fools of ourselves. Especially when doing so makes the system of white supremacy much stronger. It's time to wake up. The time believing in dumb shit is over.